This is Symbols 5, and this is the fourth of a series. So we're at the fifth presentation in the fourth of a series. Notice here that in a serial ordering, the linearity quickly becomes exhausted whenever you have an overlay of two different linear serials, so that cyclic action is the time-honored way in which you keep the first fundamental series in order and weave the second series into it. And as soon as you have established that kind of process, you can weave any number of series into the fundamental. The principle is that the very first series must be cyclical. It must come back around again. So that the fundamental pattern that seems to be observable is the ritual year. The ritual year beginning at wherever the new year begins. The Jewish New Year begins quite differently from the Chinese, and those two from the Persian, and those three from the American, and there are many New Years. But however you begin the new year, the cycle of the year makes a circular pattern within which all other series are woven. The 7 basic Jubilee festivals of the ancient Jewish New Year were woven in, and each year, each cycle, there had to be a slight adjustment to make them come out. The 12 months that we have work themselves in as a sub-series to the cyclic year. The ritual year, then, is a cycle which has a linearity. How does that linearity then become translated into a circle? Why do we not then experience some kind of curvature, some kind of infraction on the linearity? How do we not experience the inexactness of having a line which supposedly our whole lives and psyches depend upon as a measuring rod? How is it that with the curvature that we do not notice that there is a cyclic quality to it which might impair the rod-like measurement? And the answer to this is gravity. Now, once there was a beautiful demonstration at Caltech by Kip Thorne of how a satellite in orbit around the Earth goes in a straight line. The reason why its absolute perfect straight line curves and follows the shape of the Earth is because of gravity. But the satellite in its orbit does not curve at all. Its orbit is actually a mathematically straight, perfect line. But that straight, perfect line follows the cycle of the shape of the Earth. He demonstrated this by standing on a chair and taking a ball and jumping off the chair. He made it go in a straight line, but of course as he fell off the chair, the straight line became an arc. Literally, the straight line falls around the Earth, and it is absolutely mathematically straight, even though it absolutely curves and follows the shape of the Earth. So too, a ritual cycle, a fundamental ritual cycle, like the ritual year, is a very accurate straight line, and all of the rituals must be kept in alignment. The first principle, then, that establishes itself in symbolism is that the alignments must be exact on the ritual level. There can be no understanding of meaning without ritual alignment. So that, for instance, 20,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago, when men and women were transforming the landscape of the earth into a sacred space. In late Paleolithic times, men and women were interested in transforming the earth out of nature into a sacred space, a sacred geography. And various Paleolithic rock formations were always aligned along energy lines that were absolutely straight. They were called ley lines. They are today called ley lines. What they were called in Paleolithic times, no one knows. If one looks to see, for instance, in southern England, why it is that Stonehenge occupies its place on the Salisbury Plain, it is not possible to follow its alignment with certain other Paleolithic monuments. It does not line up, for instance, with Avebury, but it lines itself up with the Rollright stones, and that ley line extends itself all the way up into Northumbria. Avebury is on a different ley line. In the 1840s, in what is today the United States, a book was published called Memoirs of De Couda, an ancient sachem of the Fox Indians in southern Wisconsin. And though the book was published in 1840, it was actually based on materials gathered early in the 1800s by a man named Walter Pidgeon, who accompanied De Couda around what was then the territories that became the Middle West states of the United States: Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. And all of the terrain of those territories were covered, completely covered. The landscape was completely tattooed by mounds. Everything from what is today the Canadian border up near Lake Superior all the way down to the Ohio River was an unbroken landscape of a tapestry of mounds, of different kinds of mounds: effigy mounds taking the shapes of certain animals, geometric shapes, mounds that were geometric, and other subspecies. But the landscape was completely symbolic. The Europeans who said that it was a wilderness were blind to the symbolism. But not only was all the terrain from Lake Superior to the Ohio River covered with mounds, all the way from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast was also covered with mounds. The United States was a sacred tattoo of mounds all the way to the Atlantic coast. They've almost all been plowed up in the ensuing 400 years. Just a few have been left. The same is true of Paleolithic cultures around the world. The land itself was tattooed. This was a symbolic transformation, and the way in which the order was kept was that the serial lines, the basic alignment, even the term alignment, was kept absolutely straight. Now, it's proverbial among paleoarchaeologists of the 1990s the incredible lengths that Paleolithic men and women went to keep those lines straight. Satellite photographs of the Nazca Plain show lines so straight that they are supposed by many to have been drawn by aliens having spaceships, because there's no way that human beings on a landscape could draw straight lines for hundreds of miles, and it's simply not true. What is true is that the dedication of men and women to live lives of quality and meaning was almost more true then than now. though we find ourselves almost obsessed with trying to lead sacred lives. If a straight line is dependent upon its perfect linearity, and if that perfect linearity extended to include a natural whole bends and becomes circular, becomes cyclic, then one of the most fundamental problems in symbolism is to ascertain where the center of that cycle is, where the center of that circle is. And that center must be equidistant from every point on that line. Now, if you draw a straight line, if you have a ley line on a landscape extending hundreds of miles, where are you going to put that center? You can see it's a logistical problem of the very first order. It's simply a baffling procedure until we ask, how did Paleolithic men and women solve the problem? And they solved the problem in a radical way, which is consistent with symbolism, because symbolism is always an interiorization process. The ritual lines are exterior, but the symbolization is interior. And so the center of the line was an interior focus. The line was at the soul of the maker of the line. But in order to express that center, language was condensed, was integrated, was packed, was made into a kind of a neutron star of a single syllable words. The most famous in our time is one borrowed from the ancient Sanskrit Om. But just to show you the universality of this, of the use of single syllable symbolic words, which were the centers of the alignments. I'll give you an example that we're going to come to at the end of symbols, at the end of the symbols section. It's from a 14th century mid-English book, a medieval English book, can you imagine? Called The Cloud of Unknowing, written about 700 years ago. Anonymously, we don't know who. And in an age when one would have supposed that the Holy Church had taken everything, that the Roman Catholic Church had taken everything and condensed it, ordered it, disciplined it. Listen to the kind of written language coming from the middle of England 700 years ago about single syllable symbolic words forming the center of alignment, of cycles of sacredness. It's been cleaned up a little from the Middle English, so it's modern English. Just the meditations of those who seek to live the contemplative life, just as the meditations of those who seek to live the contemplative life come without warning, so too do their prayers. I am thinking of their private prayers, of course, not those laid down by the Holy Church. Private prayers are spontaneous, you say. Why are they spontaneous? We will find because they are playful resonances of that symbolic center. For true contemplatives could not value such prayers more, and so they use them in the form and according to the rules laid down by the Holy Fathers before us. But their own personal prayers rise spontaneously to God, without bidding of premeditation beforehand or during their prayer. In other words, soul-centered prayer is free of doctrine, free of ritual comportment, And yet there is a relationality between the free center and the linear serial alignment, which is there in ritual. He goes on, if they are in words, as they seldom are, spontaneous prayers usually are not in words, but if they are in words, as they seldom are, then they are very few words, and the fewer the better. And if it is a little word of one syllable, I think it is better than if it is of two, and more in accordance with the work of the Spirit, single syllable. For a contemplative should always live at the highest, topmost peak of spirituality. We can illustrate this by looking at nature. A man or woman suddenly frightened by fire or death or what you will, is suddenly in his extremity of spirit driven hastily and by necessity to cry or pray for help. And how does he do it? Not surely with a spate of words, not even in a single word of 2 syllables. Why? He thinks it wastes too much time to declare his urgent need and his agitation. So he burst out in his terror with one little word, and that of a single syllable. Fire. Help. And just as this little word stirs and pierces the hearts and ears of the hearers more quickly, so too does a little word of 1 syllable. When it is not merely spoken or thought, but expresses also the intention in the depth of our spirit, which is the same as the height of our spirit. The depth of our spirit is the same as the height of our spirit. Notice that if you're at the center, gravitational center, height and depth are interchangeable. And notice that height and depth are radiuses of the sphere, and that height and depth are able to be extended anywhere around. If you're at the center of the earth, getting to the surface of the earth is going up, and the up is in any direction whatsoever. And it pierces the ears of Almighty God more quickly than any long psalm churned out unthinkingly. Notice the polarity from ritual codification of prayer. Long psalms churned out unthinkingly. But notice that the height of thought is spontaneity. The height of conscientious thought is spontaneity. We are taught that thought is completely polar to spontaneity, that thought veils spontaneity, and this is a lie. This is a lie perpetrated by people who want to keep their authority established and keep their control over you firm. Nothing is freer than thought, and thought at its utmost is completely free, as in spontaneous. Notice that freedom has nothing to do with choice. It has everything to do with wildly elegant consonants. The phrase here, that is why it is written, short prayer penetrates heaven. Short prayer penetrates heaven. Single syllable symbolic words penetrate. Why does it penetrate heaven? This short little syllable prayer. 1 syllable. Surely because it is prayed with a full heart in the height and depth and length and breadth of the Spirit. Notice the quaternary, height and depth, length and breadth. Notice here that in high mystical symbolic understanding, space has 4 dimensions, not 3. Not just height and length and breadth, but also depth. Space has 4 dimensions, so that time, instead of being a 4th dimension to 3-dimensional space, is a 5th dimension to 4-dimensional space. So that time becomes quintessential. So that time-space, instead of being a 4-dimensional continuum, is a 5-dimensional field. And as a field, it expresses energy rather than matter. Four-dimensional space-time carries the permutations of materiality in a time sequence, but a five-dimensional time-space carries instead the permutations of figuration that come from a symbolic continuum. When you integrate a quaternary, like a four-dimensional time-space, you come to a place of a point. When you integrate a five-dimensional time-space, you come to a vanishing. To give it a name, the only name that has come down in contemporary thought is, again, from India. It was called Bindu. Bindu. A yogi who brings his time-space through integration to a vanishing point. That vanishing point, that point which implodes in upon itself and vanishes, so that one then says of the phenomena that existed before that it has vanished. The word for vanishing in Hindu thought is moksha, extinction. Moksha, extinction. And the locus of the moksha is the bindu. The Buddha called it tatha, ta. Tatha, ta. And one who goes through that vanishing point is the Tathagata, one who is gone beyond. What happens beyond? What's on the other side of that looking glass? What is on the other side of the looking glass of dimensions of space-time? The Buddha, in his wonderful humanity, said, another shore. Another shore. And we will see next year that that other shore is the spiritual person, who does not occur ever in the whole cycle of integration. No person ever was real in the entire cycle of integration. The person is real in a completely different mode, beyond the transformation of going beyond. The last thing that one says before going beyond is a single syllable, followed by, just as Om is followed by an exclamation mark to indicate arising, followed by a non-verbal absorption. A non-verbal absorption. Now, when we come to try to appreciate this, one of the best friends that we can have is Suzanne Langer. Her book, Philosophy in a New Key, written about 45 years ago, 50 years ago almost now, it's hard to believe. When she talks about symbolic transformation, she says that one of the peculiarities about symbols is that language tends to have word magic. She writes here on page 36 of Philosophy in a New Key, if our basic needs were really just those of lower creatures, much refined, we should have evolved a more realistic language than we have in fact. If the mind were essentially a recorder and transmitter, typified by the simile of the telephone exchange, we should act very differently from the way we actually do. Certainly, no, quote, learning process has caused man to believe in magic, yet Word magic is a common practice among all primitive peoples. And so is vicarious treatment, burning an effigy, etc., where the proxy is plainly a mere phenomenon that is ritual. It is obviously symbolic, except where it is aimed at concrete results, and then it may be regarded as a communal form of magic. Now, all magical and ritual practices are hopelessly inappropriate to the preservation and increase of life. My cat would turn up his nose and his tail at them. To regard them as mistaken attempts to control nature as a result of wrong synapses or crossed wires in the brain seems to me to leave the most rational of animals too deep in the slough of error. If a savage in his ignorance of physics tries to make a mountain open its caverns by dancing round it, we must admit with shame that no rat in a psychologist's maze would try such patently ineffectual methods of opening a door. And she goes on to say that what seems to be characteristic here is that the employment of this can be characterized by the word play. It's a play phenomenon. Play. One of the most perspicacious of all the European critics after the Second World War, Johann Huizinga, a Belgian trying to make sense out of a world completely shambled, finally wrote a book called Homo Ludens, play man. That man at play is the only way in which we slip out of and escape a static horror so horrendous and massive that it simply freezes us. Like the proverbial birds before the cobra. The horror of the world. The inanity of what actually occurs is impossible to accept without play, without humor. And the whole quality of play and humor, of comedy, becomes that opening up of space to its four dimensions. The whole process of comedy is that space suddenly has an extra dimension that it did not have before. Whereas in the tragic view of life, one can live long enough, deep enough to understand that you reach dead ends from which there is no escape whatsoever. But the comic aspect is that exactly at that moment, change happens. Unpredictability occurs. Something fresh happens. A creative quality at play, not at all statically frozen and hypnotized like some little bird, but creates suddenly a complete change. One of the best examples of this in recent art was Ingmar Bergman's wonderful film, Smiles of a Summer Night, where the protagonist, going through a complicated love affair, finally realizes that he has been jilted exactly because he is an idiot, and realizes this and goes to one of these old-fashioned four-poster beds and rigs up a noose and a rope and hangs himself. And just as his body would snap his neck, the weight of the body triggers the bed, which is on one of these trick rollers. And the wall gives way, and instead of hanging him, the bed swings out and swings him into another room where a beautiful woman is crying because she's been jilted by her lover. And just as she's bemoaning like this, he's swung around and thrown into her arms. It's the only comedy Bergman's ever made. It's this quality which makes of very profound writers like Dante. He entitles his epic excursion The Divine Comedy. Or Balzac, who could look at human nature completely and see everyone just as they really are. All of his novels together, La Comédie Humaine, the whole aspect here, We laugh at Don Quixote because Don Quixote has an out. He has an extra dimension. He has a spiritual quality. What is the spiritual quality of Don Quixote? That he, despite all that he goes through, will ride again. Because the reader can come back when he has finished Don Quixote and begin again. And it's true that Cervantes wrote the second part because there were so many Englishmen trying to cash in on his fame without paying any royalties that they were writing sequels to it, not understanding that Don Quixote was a kind of a cycle of infinity. He wrote a second section, just like Goethe's second part of Faust, and the second section of Cervantes' Don Quixote shows the man completely conscious. There were only two conscious men. Unfortunately, all the conscious women refused to write in those days. But there were only two conscious men of that age, that were Shakespeare and Cervantes. And they understood that life is too serious to be a tragedy. In other words, there's too much real meaning for it to end. Because the weight of meaning cannot simply be dismissed by a death or by a static dead end. Just because the mountain falls on you and you are crushed to death doesn't mean that you're not existent. You are a crushed pancake of bone and flesh and blood, and that is real there underneath that mountain. And given this universe, it has to take in, it has to compute anything that is there. And so who knows what kinds of permutations come out. So when Suzanne Langer says, another item in human behavior is our serious attitude towards art. Serious attitude towards art. Genetic psychology usually regards art as a form of play, a luxury product of the mind. This is not only a scientific theory, it is common sense view. We play at an instrument. We act to play. Yet, like many common sense doctrines, it is probably false. Great artists are rarely recruited from the leisure class, and it is only in careless speech that we denote music or tragedy as our hobby. We do not really class them with tennis or bridge. And we will see that in this conundrum that art also does not occur in the entire ecology of integration. There is no art in integration. Art is a differential process, and it's in a completely complementary process because differentiation complements integration. Just as we will find there is no cosmos in integration whatsoever. There's only nature. And it only doesn't mean just nature. With great respect, nature is all the way to the vanishing point. The last shore which the waves of resonance of nature's change wash upon is the interior vanishing point of the soul. But they don't go beyond that. Because beyond that, immediately on the other side of that mirror, a wonderland occurs. A magic realm occurs where nature no longer is in operation, but magic is at play. Or, to turn it the other way around, it is as it is in tradition. The old tradition was that nature no longer plays on that side, but magic operates. The magician is an operator exactly to the extent that nature no longer constrains him. Why? Or her. Why? In either case, him or her. The magician is a resonance of the free spontaneity of the vanishing point and has nothing to do whatsoever with the constrictions of constant change, but has everything to do with the structures of symbolic meaning. And so a transformation happens. The changes of nature become the operations of a symbolic realm. That's what magic was all about. And the biggest magic there is, the biggest magic is the art of person making. To make a person real in the face of a nature which is never real, always happening but never there. That is fantastic magic. That's the big magic. I remember walking around Los Angeles in 1975 with Karma Tinley, who's now the head of a Tibetan order in London. And someone asked him, well, aren't you Tibetans in this Vajrayana supposed to be great magicians? Can't you make tables rise, and can't you make things happen? And he looked at them and he said in his quite fine English, he said, the big magic in our time is for people to be real. That is really big magic, because in this ecology that we have, almost no one does that anymore. Almost no one that you meet is real. They are functions of this or that ritual cycle. They are in alignments of this or that series. They have mythic dramas that are at play, and they even have some symbolic structures. But nowhere in that whole ecology is there any objectiveness which we reach as a person. And consequently, the cosmos is also not real. As long as one stays within the integration ecology, nature in its playful creativeness will always recede from you to the extent that you pursue it. You build a telescope the size of a football field to see 20 billion light years out into space, and you will find that there are 20 billion light year structures tantalizingly leading you on. You look for the top quark and you say, well, if we can only get to so many Z billion energy volts, we can see this particle, and beyond that, it would crush into amazing new avenues. Always there is the receding to the extent that you are pursuing it. Why? Because integration only comes to a focus by acceptance, never by pursuit. You can never pursue wisdom. You can only accept it. Truth is meaning accepted, not meaning pursued. What is true is that the meaning has been accepted. And at the crushable center of acceptance, as the book of Job points out so eloquently, at the crushable center of acceptance is a vanishing point called absorption. And none of Job's comforters or detractors understand this, including his wife, including the Satan. They do not understand this. The only person who understands it is Job, and the only cosmic figure that understands this is God. That at the point of absorption, a transformation happens where life, the person, the cosmos is again real, regardless of what has happened before, regardless of how tragic it was before, regardless of how perilous, how brutal, how stupid, how interminable, irregardless of that bug list of stupidity, is the surprise beauty of the exactness of the Spirit when it differentially reoccurs on the other shore. The book of Job is the best example that we have. Now, I've found in my researches, just to cut time short, that the book of Job was written by the teacher of righteousness who's the founder of the Qumran Essene community, and he wrote it about 160 BC. And he wrote it in face of a titanically perilous situation where everything about his world had completely dissolved, and like Job, he had only one thing left, but that thing would not stay put. It continually imploded in upon itself. And that is the sense of his own center. And the sense of the center, as we began today, about 45 minutes ago, the sense of the center is checkable because it is always equidistant from a serial alignment which is objectively real in this world. That while the vanishing center cannot be known, the fact that it is exactly equidistant from every point on an objective linear alignment in this world can be known. And that fact is what traditionally was called, the phrase was traditionally the saving grace. So that all sacred rituals were different from profane rituals. Profane rituals always have their objective purpose in view, whereas sacred rituals never have it in view. A sacred ritual process always is built for acceptance of the unknown. Like the festival meal that has an extra place set at the table that no one may sit at, only the stranger, only the presence that will come when it comes. The Navajo weaving that has the one thread that's left out of the pattern, the spirit trail. The round table that has the one seat, the siege perilous, that no knight occupies. The Zen Sumie circle that doesn't quite close because one has to keep this open. The top of the cranium, the Saharastra chakra, which, as the Hopis say, must be kept open so that the prayers that we have in our mind go out and go to grandfather, go to grandmother. A sacred ritual always has a focus of absorption which is kept completely open, and nothing is put there by man. So that the ritual works when nothing happens. It works precisely because, in our terms, nothing happened. If something happens, if it meets an expectation, then it was profane. So that there is a mysteriousness to spirituality which is forever radically alien to those who cleverly plan everything out. They are always wrong. They are never right. They are absolutely wrong. And this is why absorption cannot be placed into some kind of a schemata as an objective item. It is always the openness that is left. And generally the openness, surprisingly, becomes the context, like the fifth dimension, like the fourth dimension of space. It becomes the context in which all of the other activity has happened. The best illustration of this is the way in which Manly Hall laid out the major arcana of the tarot deck, of putting the 21 cards of the major arcana against the 0 card of the Fool. The 0 card of the Fool is the absorption center. Not only is it the absorption center, but it is the absorptive context of the entire operation. The omega point is always the alpha. Because the omega point is a vanishing back into the alpha spontaneously, immediately, always. In one of the little thrown away infancy stories about the 5-year-old Jesus, the precocious, bad little boy Jesus. He's thrown out of school because he bugs the schoolmaster. He will not say his alphabet. Instead, he says to the schoolmaster, if you can tell me what alpha is, then I will tell you what beta is. Meaning that only by understanding the creation, the beginning, can one then understand what the alignment is. And that understanding the creation, the beginning, and that alignment all the way to the so-called end are both dependent upon the center. And that sacred triangle, that's the Trinity, that's the three-part, that's the whole purpose of symbols, is to interiorize deep enough so that one activates the absorptive center, the unknown mysterious center. And when it comes into play, notice the term, when it comes into play, any possibility is real. Any possibility is real. Let's take a break and we'll come back. So these are slides from William Blake's illustrations to the book of Job. And of course, they're more than just illustrations. And I'm going to just show them this week, and then progressively next week and the week after and the following week go deeper and deeper into them. If you recall, last week's lecture was called Symbolic Augurs. Try and concentrate on this. A symbol works like an augur. It goes deeper and deeper in because the cycles are not static. They're playful. They're creative. So each time there is a cycle of a symbol, it goes deeper. And it's not so much that they're deeper levels, although you can say that there are deeper levels, but it's that the process is one of penetration. Symbols do not spiral in indefinitely. There comes a point of penetration. So this is what needs to be looked at. And so the next 3 weeks after this, we will take Blake's Job and try to go to the point of penetration, which is the absorption. And the reason why Blake's Job is so very good at this is not only is it the subject matter, the content of the material, but it is also the very form that the content is presented in. And third, because of Blake's mystical, prophetic personality, he's also a great artist as well as a fine poet, as well as a religious seer. The method by which these forms were made is also consonant. So the content, the form, and the method of making the form are all in alignment. And so it's one of the very best examples that one could have to show how symbols augur. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about how in ancient divination, there were two different persons involved in the divination. One was the person who saw the omen. The other was the person who interpreted the omen, and they were different people. With Augustus Caesar, because of his compulsive preoccupation with having all the magic in the world under his thumb, the augurs became associated with the state religion of Rome. Anyone can see an apparition of the Virgin Mary, little peasant Italian children. Only the church can interpret what it means. You understand? Comprende? That's it. As long as an authoritarian system controls the valuation calibration, you can be as free as you want, but what it means must be in our terms. As Simone de Beauvoir once observed of the so-called vaunted American freedom in New York City, she said, from what I see, Americans can build as high as they want to as long as they stay on their block. It's very existential. A very free human being. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to acclimate ourselves to something very important, which if you miss, you've missed it all. What is it that you could miss? That the spiral cycling of symbols is not indefinite, but goes to a certain point and then penetrates. That meaning becomes more and more condensed, more and more integrated, more and more packed. The levels are deeper, the quote levels are higher, but at a certain extent, penetration happens, absorption happens. And at that point, it's an art, the art of divination. One has to stop interpreting and accept the meaning. And when one stops interpreting and accepts the meaning, what occurs then is a mystical absorption. A true prayer is followed by silence. A spiritual prayer is the silence. He's so quotable, I have to keep using him. Jesus said at one place, he said, your Father in heaven knows what you need even before you say it. How would he not know? Are you so obscure? What is unusual, as we will see, is that absorptive transformation, though it is never there, has nevertheless a resonance. Openness has a resonance. Mysteriousness has a resonance. And that the resonances have a mathematical relationship on the differential realm to the integral realm. To put it simply, however you have integrated, that's how you would differentiate. Or to put it in a homey little thing, whatever recipe you follow, that's what's coming out of the oven. So that you don't have to control. You don't have to have an authoritarian need to control the differential process at all. A true differential process is free. The place to take care is in the integration. With nature, with ritual, with myth, with symbols. You take care. And then you let them go. Because they're only real then if they're let go. To the extent that we still cling to them, that clinging in the Buddhist language of Magadhi, which was a variant of Sanskrit, it was called klisa. To the extent that you cling, those pressures are imperfections. And to that extent, the process, instead of transforming and going into a differential consonance, regresses. It becomes a recursive quality that goes back regressively. And where is it going to go? A regressive symbol always goes completely through language back to the ritual level, because the ritual level is the only place where there's any objectivity. And so instead of the person becoming objective, the ritual level becomes hyper-inflated with a supra-objectivity, and that's the seed that begins the whole neurotic process. Inflation. And to the extent that one then believes in that inflated world, to that extent one is deluded. And when you're completely at home in your delusion, that's psychotic. So this is a very interesting quality here, where symbols are literally a fulcrum. And when they work in a way that they transform nature into consciousness. Because that fifth dimension, that other aspect, that depth of space becomes consciousness. Awareness becomes consciousness. And it has a quality which, instead of being just simply a mirroring, which is the ego, which is an inflated sense of mask. The ego is an inflated mask, one that parades itself as your identity. Instead of that mirroring quality, symbols then have a reflective quality. And because the reflection comes back to one's openness, one's absorption, you literally establish an algorithmic consonance leading to the cosmos of openness. That's why the cosmos is boundless. It is boundless precisely because it is a consonance of the openness of the soul. Whereas if the soul is established as some point, not only is there no differential process, no person, no cosmos, there's that mirroring which comes back and inflationally makes the ego think that it is a person. And then the ego tries to make the world into its cosmos, using other people as its pawns. And this whole demonic process becomes quite involved, because then there are billions of competing egos. And it doesn't matter if you have the best economist in the world theorizing. You're going to have a mess. We live in that murky, dirty water. But as the old saying goes, our emergence from that is such that it's like the lotus. There's no trace of that when we really emerge. Why? Because the absorptiveness is the purifier, the cleanest clean that you can get is completely absorbed. This is why in any real yoga, an absorptive state comes out as a kind of a language consonance which can be literally applied everywhere. Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras calls it pranama. Pranama. And one can take that magic language, that magic word, and apply it anywhere. And wherever it is applied, it's like the alchemical tincture. That becomes a part of that differential freedom. And though to the ego it's only a theory, the theory goes that all it takes is one free soul in the entire cosmos, and the entire cosmos is freed permanently. And so if there ever was anyone completely freed, ever in any past, on any planet, in any star system, the whole cosmos is already sacred. As somebody wrote on the wall once in Hollywood in black letters, relax, it is 100% out of your hands. Okay, let's come back now. This is the third illustration from Blake's Job. let's pan back. Okay, are we there? Janet, can you move just a slight bit? There we are. Okay, now let's come back to the beginning. 2 slides back. Okay, this is to acquaint us. I have the book of Job done up on black and white, a version, and I have a colored version done up. And as soon as I can get to the Pierpont Morgan Library version, which is a 3rd colored version, I will do that up too. And then when we're finished with this, you can make copies for yourselves of these things. You can go to any print shop, and on cardstock you can make copies for yourself. What's important for us now is to see the process by which we become increasingly acquainted with a symbol, so that as our acquaintance increases, the spiral auguring of its meaning reaches the penetration point. That's what we're doing here. So this week we're just going to look at the 22 illustrations very briefly and then come back to the rest of the lecture. Next week, after the break, we'll go a little bit deeper. The 3rd week, a little bit deeper. And the 4th week, hopefully deep enough so that some penetration can occur. Very erotic. Okay, this is the title. Notice the date, 1825. Blake's first illustration to Job was a single plate done in 1786. So he spent almost 40 years thinking and working as a visionary artist on the book of Job. He died in 1827, so it was literally the whole of his mature adult life, from age 30 to about age 70, that he spent on this. One thing about Blake that we can know here, when Blake was 8 years old, he saw angels playing instruments in the trees around the place in London where his parents lived. And he told his parents, and they realized that they had a mystical son. So instead of apprenticing him to some kind of pedestrian trade, they apprenticed him to an engraver. One practical way of making a living as an artist in the late 1700s in England was engraving. When Blake was put into the engraving class, he was so peculiar vis-a-vis the other students that the teacher, a man named Roger, decided that the best way that Blake could learn, because he had fantastic talent and was very absorbed in his method, he assigned him to engrave one of the great Gothic buildings of London, Westminster Abbey. If you've ever been in there or seen photographs, Westminster Abbey is an infinite playground of detail. And so Blake, for 5 years, engraved every aspect of Westminster Abbey. He went into detail after detail after detail, and sort of like a graduation present for him, when he was 21 years old, they brought out the sarcophagus and the coffin in it of the last king of ancient Britain before the Norman invasion, Edward the Confessor. And they opened the sarcophagus, they opened the coffin, and there, laying on the skeleton, was a shroud, just like the Shroud of Turin. And when they peeled the shroud back, the impress of the flesh of Edward the Confessor was on the shroud, the image of it, his facial features, even though there was a skeleton laying in the coffin. And Blake, being the mystic that he was, understanding this was God's degree to him for having patiently engraved everything in Westminster Abbey, understood that the right way to make spiritual works was to make them so that they would print out their reality. You don't put the reality on the engraving. You make the engraving so it prints its reality on the page, so that the page is real. And that's when he realized that you must write backwards on the engraving so it prints out right. And that man is given a confused world because only by having the world confused is it possible for him to see it truthfully within, because it's backwards out there. That's why it seems confused. It's a regressive alignment that prints out as a series when one opens one's mind. And this was the whole mystical process that he had. He found that the archetype of this figure was Job. Job was open enough to God to let God print out exactly as he was. So here's the title page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Notice that in these stages you have various phases. The kind of young naivete, the youthful aspiration, the older coming to grips with it, the more mature sense of being able to look back, the really mature sense of being able to take it in, and the transcendent quality of letting it all come in, and then the absorptive quality of going out again. So in 7 phases, on the very title page of the book of Job, you have this transformation in 7 phases of the person from a naive youth to an absorptive maturity. Next slide. After the title page, there are 21 prints, and we're just going to look at them briefly, and then we're going to come back. Okay, this is number 1. Notice the musical instruments in the trees, just as Job as a little boy saw. Can we focus that? There we go. Okay. Now let's come back to 2. Go forward to 2, rather. Next slide. The Satan. In the ancient Hebrew, Satan is always a neuter. Never a male, never a female. Always a neuter. And so the particle the is always there. The Satan. The Satan is neither man nor woman. Is neuter. So the whole process of coming into contact with Satan is that you short out. Your sexuality, whatever it is, shorts out. Why? Because that's the energeia of your creativeness. So that the creativeness shorts out. When the old ancient Irish monks, who were the last people in the classical world to speak Greek in the 600s AD, out in places like Iona, they imaged symbolically the Satan as a burnt-out stick figure, always in the margin of manuscripts, never in the illustrations, in the symbols. One of the last surviving illustrations of that is in the book of Kells, where on one of the fantastic pages, within all the wheels within wheels, spirals, and details, that Byzantine cosmos influencing that Celtic visionary scene, outside of everything is a stick figure of a Satan trying not to get in, but to come into contact, to short it out. So that the experience of the Satan in the book of Job is that the Satan presents himself along with everyone else on Yom Yahweh, the Lord's Day. There comes a day, Yom Yahweh, where everyone presents himself, and as soon as the Satan presents himself, God instantly responds, spontaneously asks him, "Where do you come from?" Not that he wants to know, but it's a reflective question to him. Do you know where you come from? And the Satan always replies, from roving to and fro on the earth. He doesn't come from anywhere, but he comes from the nervous pacing to and fro on the earth, meaning the pacing to and fro, the nervousness of existence. That's where the Satan comes from. He comes from the nervousness of existence, the neurotic nervousness. He comes from anxiety. He comes from the plane of anxiety. And so God always comes back with the same archetypal follow-up question, which is a corollary to the first. Then you must know Job. Because Job is the number one person who manages to live there. It is not that Job is free from anxiety, but he has found a way to live in that world. And the reply by the Satan is always the same. Oh, him. Yeah, I know about him. He's a jerk. He just looks good because you've given him stuff. Take it away and see what, we know what he's like. And so Yahweh says, I give him in your power, only you may not kill him. And this happens twice at the beginning of the book of Job. So that you get the sense that there's a phase penetration happening. So here's the Satan coming through. And look how he's running. It looks like there's flames, but if you look, the flames are also the long hair of people entwined. And here's Job and his family down below. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. And here's the Satan in his egotistical glory, causing pain. He focuses anxiety. The Satan is a neuter person working in a polar opposite way. Just as the person is a prism for openness, the Satan is a prism for closedness, for phobia, for claustrophobia, for agoraphobia. The Satan is a neuter person who prisms phobic, nervous energy and makes it applied there. And where's the there? What screen is available to have this kind of perverse negative focus? The only screen in the whole universe is the ego. Only the ego is on a plane where it could receive that kind of focus. The ego is the only place that anxiety can fix itself. Anxiety passes through the soul as if it were not there. The spiritual person is so open that the chances of one particle of anxiety hitting one particle of a person are nil. But the ego is exactly there on that regressive plane where anxiety can be brought into a focus. And so the Satan says, I know him. Let me at him. And here he is. The next slide, please. Notice that this quotation is the end of Moby Dick. I alone am escaped to tell thee. Next slide. The Satan again comes. He says, well, all right, here I am. Yahweh says, where do you come from? He says, from roving to and fro in the earth. He says, have you considered my servant Job? Yes, he says. And he would have shown his true stuff, but we didn't go far enough. You just killed his children. You just took his flocks. Get him. Then you'll see. Dice him up. Then you'll see. Next slide. And so the Satan focuses not on just the ambience, the world of Job, his children, his estate, but on his body. because the ego mistakenly identifies the body as itself. That's why the anxiety has to be here and becomes psychosomatic, because that's the only plane. So the ego uses the body as like its mask, its place, its plane, and anxiety focuses there. Here's the Satan doing that. Sores and boils. Notice from the sole of the foot to the crown of the head. The sole of the foot, if you put a hand under the sole of someone's foot and you put another hand on the crown of someone, in between those parentheses is the entire physical alignment of the person. And one peculiar thing, there are at least a dozen good yogas that you can master that show this, is that nervous energy, neural energy, fills this entire body, but does not stop with the crown of the head, but goes above it. Neural energy is not limited by the crown of the head at all, but goes above it. You can literally go through a perilous kind of a yoga where you can have the rising of terror in oneself and have it come and fill you completely, and yet you are calm above it. The old Hermetic tradition used to put an infinity sign over the head of somebody like that. Or you see the saints with the halo, the thought bubble around their head. That's the sphere of calmness beyond that. Because the psychophysical ego identity with the body cannot transcend the body. It ends at the fingernails. It ends at the crown of the head. It ends at the sole of the feet. Next slide, please. So as Job sits, 3 friends, 3 comforters, 3 cronies come to sit with him, and then finally they begin to question him. They say, well, this is so terrible. What have you done? You must have done something. And so they grind more and more subtle. Well, let's really find out what you really did. Let's go deeper. Let's find out where you are guilty. Because suffering must be a punishment in recompense for a bad act of which you are guilty. Notice here that there's a whole reference. Suffering is a punishment. Well, maybe it's not a punishment. Because of a guilt, maybe there's no correlation at all. But notice here that the ego, in order to maintain itself, must maintain these kinds of correlations. There must be this kind of correlation. And as the book of Job goes on, we see more and more subtle correlations tried. And at each level, Job understands that that's not it. Next slide, please. Till finally, he is willing to have himself effaced from the earth, effaced from life. Let the day in which I was born perish. Next slide. Then one of the detractors goes into one of these grand schemes of saying, it's so subtle, it's so complex that you don't realize. You're in the suffering so much, you're consumed by this punishment so much that you do not know. God is much greater than what you suppose. And the Comforter supposes that his scale exceeds that of Job's. That he knows what Job... Next slide. Till finally the comforters become accusers. They're finally convinced We don't know what you did, but you had to have done something. And since this is so vicious, so violent, what you have done that we don't know about is so heinous that you are really to blame. And so scorn comes out. Next slide. And Job is completely enveloped. His psychic energy is completely demonized. But Job himself is untouched. Next slide. So here comes a fourth comforter, detractor, a young man. Because the three friends, the three contemporaries, have gone through this whole litany. They've ended with scorn. Job has been roasted alive. He's frazzled. So they're sitting there and they're all frazzled. Okay, well, that's it. But we're still here. And the younger one comes in and says, from my generation, this whole thing stinks. This is what the truth is. This is what's really going on. You didn't really understand, and I'm here to straighten you up. Next slide. But Job is adamant. And in his adamancy, and notice that the word adamantine is very close to adamant, that adamant to the point of compression becomes adamantine. The resistance to the ego becomes so compressed that the resistance itself turns it into a jewel. Adamantine is in a diamond. This is why one of the great similes of the soul is that of a jewel. A jewel. God comes as a whirlwind. Now notice this whirlwind quality. The whirlwind is a spiraling. The whirlwind is a spiraling. It's a cycle that as it goes round, gains in intensity, gains to penetration. And out of the depths of the whirlwind, at the point of penetration of the spiral of the divine, comes language. The voice from the whirlwind. Yahweh is no longer an iconographic figure, but is a voice from the whirlwind. Where is that spiral? Where is that whirlwind? It's the auger which Job himself is. His spirit is that auger to the point of penetration where he hears the voice from the other side, the voice from God. Next slide. And then one of the great parts, this slide is like a fulcrum of the illustrations of the book of Job. It's number 14. So if you have the title page, and you number the title page 0, like the Fool card of the Tarot deck, and then you number the other 21 pages, and arrange them in 3 sevens, this particular illustration is the end of the second row. In other words, this illustration is 2/3 of the way through the linearity of the book of Job. Now, we've talked about this before. What is so deeply important about the 2/3 point? Not only have you gone 2/3, but there's 1/3 remaining. If you take a linearity, let's take it in the symbolic form of a spear. A spear. If you hold a spear exactly in the center, and you balance a spear, you balance it statically. But if you hold it with your hand exactly at the center, and you try to throw it, you cannot throw it. Not very far. You realize that you have to hold the spear back from the center, somewhere back from the center, in order to throw it. And that the human hand, the human arm, throws a spear with the most power to penetrate 2/3 back. In the Olympics, a javelin thrower will hold a javelin 2/3 back because you can throw a linearity with enough power to penetrate through a target. The only improvement on that comes from the magic realm, which man discovered about 60,000 years ago. And that is, if you put a spear thrower, a piece of cloth or a piece of hide, and wrap it around the end of the spear and hold it with your hand at 2/3 of the place, with a spear thrower, you can penetrate something about 10 times the power. But that's from the magic realm. That's using symbolic geometry to really improve. With the natural hand, 2/3 of the way back is the place where you grab a linearity so that you can throw it. Remember that the ancient Greek word symbolion meant thrown together. When meaning is thrown together, that's what a symbol does. It throws meaning together in a sense that it focuses it. It makes dynamic gestalts. It's like a quick fry cook. Those dynamic gestalts are made in the moment. When that symbolic meaning is fresh in that moment, that's where creative play and insight have their place. That's where the Promethean spark of understanding is there. That's where the dimension of the quintessential comes into play and frees up what was frozen, what was static. So this particular illustration, number 14, is the place in the illustrations for Job by Blake where the whole line of meaning can be held by the human hand in a natural way and used as a penetration. So we'll come back to this card. Now notice here that the card following number 14, the 15th card, has this great complementation. The sea beast and the land beast. The land and the sea. The great complementarity. Go back 2 slides to God in the Whirlwind. The slide before number 14, which is 13. No, go back. Back. Now we're in business. Number 13, the slide before 14, is related to number 15. In a kind of like bookends surrounding number 14, 13 is about the spiral whirlwind of God, and number 15 is about the complementarity structure of the real world. Okay, let's go forward 2 slides. So we'll come back next week, and when we get into 13, 14, 15, we'll try to go deeper and see what else is there. Okay, now let's go on to 16. Can we focus that? And then number 17. Number 18. Number 19. Number 20. Notice by number 20 that Job begins to assume that same symbolic posture which God had. Job has become magnetized to the divine. Notice that a magnetic alignment is different from a geophysical alignment. A magnetic alignment is always ordinal and not cardinal, to put it into terms. A magnetic pole is not necessarily the geographical pole. On this planet, it's 23 degrees, 23 and a half degrees off. There's almost no planet where it's exact. It would be a real rarity to have a planet with the magnetic and geographic poles exact. This magnetic quality, Job is now ordinarily magnetized. Symbols do that magnetizing. And the magnetic world in which their meaning then comes into play is the realm of magic, which we call vision today. Vision. So that someone living in a visionary way literally sees the real structure which is there and would be apparent would wholeness be in operation. The soul is that presence, always. Let's just give an example. If someone loses an arm through some accident and it's surgically removed, the psychophysical wholeness of oneself still includes that arm. Just as after death, when this body is gone, the psychophysical wholeness still includes that body, as if it were there. Just as the arm is not there in a cardinal way, and the body is not there in a cardinal way, in the ordinal magnetic wholeness, it is still there. Still operative. Next slide. So the 21st slide is related to the first slide. The 21st slide, all the instruments are out of the trees and into the hands of the people. The fruit of the music capacity of the spiritual person has been put into play, has been picked and harvested. The musical capacity has been harvested. And music is always, like music with this kind of instrumentation, is always in the differential mode. In the integral mode, what passes as music is usually rhythm, some kind of percussive syncopation rhythm. But music which uses some kind of a scale for its expressive development is always in the differential mode. So that there's a monumental way to tell the difference between an ego and a person. Monumental. The person will respond to music, whereas the ego responds on the primordial level to percussive syncopation, to the beat. Which would you prefer, the melody or the beat? It's a way of seeing whether there's a ritual basis to the audio spectrum or whether there's an art basis. Because art is very objective, as objective as ritual. But the objectivity in art is the person, whereas the objectivity in ritual is existence. And yes, existence is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all of everything. If you offer someone a choice between a little cassette on Mozart and a cassette on rap music, you can use the litmus test and find out what's going on pretty fast. It doesn't take much. It don't take much, as John Wayne once said. I think he said it that way. It don't take much. So in keeping with that, next week, Pilgrim. Thank you.